Welcome to another Tutor Short provided by the Educational Support Services Department of Lehigh Carbon Community College in Schnecksville, PA, just outside Allentown. These videos provide key learnings for English and other writing-based courses provided here at LCCC. Please remember that the Educational Support Services Department does provide walk-in tutoring 5 days a week. Online writing tutoring is also available through the college website. Today we're going to be talking about constructing complete sentences. Now, a complete sentence is actually fairly simple. All you need is a capital letter at the beginning, a subject, a verb, and a period. So you need a noun at the beginning, something that noun is doing, and then a period at the end. In this case, we have an example here that is T.S. Eliot wrote The Wasteland. That's a famous early 20th century poem that I'm sure you're going to run into in some English class sometime during your college career. So our subject here, our noun, is T.S. Eliot. He wrote, that's the action, The Wasteland. So we've got a noun and a verb. And then at the very end, we've got our period. The wasteland is actually just sort of an extraneous piece of information that isn't essential to the sentence from a grammatical standpoint. We can tell that this stuff is essential because if we removed any of it, we'd end up with an incomplete sentence. It just wouldn't sound quite right. For example, if we take out T.S. Eliot, we end up with wrote the wasteland, which is pretty dramatic, but doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's just sort of an action with no actor. There's no one writing, it's just sort of being written. We need that T.S. Eliot in there to make that make sense. Wrote, similarly, if removed, leaves us with T.S. Eliot, The Wasteland, which almost sounds like a modern poem in and of itself, but it isn't really a complete sentence. We don't have any verb to show us how T.S. Eliot relates to the wasteland. There's just two nouns kind of stuck together. So you can see that those two bits are essential, but what about the wasteland? Well, if we get rid of that, we end up with T.S. Eliot wrote. Well, that's true. T.S. Eliot was a writer, he wrote. That's a complete sentence and a logical thought. And if we add back in our period at the end, we end up with a full sentence. So, the wasteland, even though it helps clarify the sentence, isn't actually an essential part. Now, you might be thinking, well, I can stop the video right here, that's all I need. This is pretty straightforward, and I don't think I'll ever make a mistake about this. Well, maybe, but it's worth knowing a quick trick for proofreading longer sentences, because some of your sentences in your essays, especially as you get higher into, further into your education, some of your sentences will be quite a bit longer and a little bit harder to untangle. Take this example. T.S. Eliot, in order to show the chaos of modern existence in 1922. There's something missing there. But there's such a jumble of prepositional phrases, there's so many non-essential pieces of information here that it's kind of hard to figure out just what we need to add in. So let's take out what isn't essential. Any prepositional phrases, anything that begins with words like in, to, above, below, anything like that can be taken out to clarify your sentence. So we'll take out in order, to show almost as a verb, but if you wrote just T.S. Eliot to show on its own, that wouldn't make a whole lot of sense, would it? It can't really stand on its own as a complete sentence. The chaos, that's just a noun. Of modern existence, another prepositional phrase, and in 1922, another prepositional phrase. Well, that's practically the whole sentence. The only thing we've got left is T.S. Eliot at the very beginning, our subject. So what we are missing is a verb. We're missing an action. At the very end, then, to fix this, I'll write in T.S. Eliot wrote The Wasteland. And our period at the end. And remember, the wasteland is our non-essential piece of information that we're adding in to make the sentence a little clearer, but now we have our subject, T.S. Eliot, our action, wrote, and at the very end, a period to close the sentence off. Now that we have that, now that we have all the important essential parts of the sentence, we can go back into what we took out as non-essential and put it back in. So we didn't remove it permanently, we just read the sentence without it to help us clarify what was missing and what we needed to add back in. This is a great strategy for when you're using sentences this long or even longer to make sure that all of your verbs and your subjects are present and in agreement. I often use this myself when I'm proofreading my own papers. I read out loud the sentences without all that extra stuff to make sure they sound correct. So great, you're thinking. Well, this is all I need. I know what a complete sentence is, I know how to write it, and I know how to check to make sure that all of the parts that I need are there. What else could I want? Well, there's one other problem you might run into. It's almost the reverse of this problem. It's not a sentence fragment, but a run-on sentence. A run-on sentence happens when you have a complete sentence and then even more complete sentence. Too much complete sentence, in other words. Let's look at our example here. T.S. Eliot, in order to show the chaos of modern existence, in 1922 wrote The Wasteland. Ezra Pound wrote in a station of the Metro. There's something a little off there. You kind of run out of breath by the end, for one thing, but for another thing, it all sounds sort of mashed together in a rather strange way. A run-on sentence isn't just a sentence that goes on for a long time. A run-on sentence is sort of like if you take two sentences and crush them together. Let's look at why this happens. If we check out our subjects and verbs, we've got T.S. Eliot with the verb wrote. So we've got our subject and what he's doing. And then Ezra Pound, our other subject, wrote. So we've got actually two verbs here and two subjects, two people doing two things. So we don't actually have one complete sentence here. We have two complete sentences, and two complete sentences need to stand on their own. There's an easy fix for this, actually. If we just go in here at our at the very beginning clause, which is a sentence part that could stand on its own, if we add in our trusty period there, we end up with T.S. Eliot wrote The Wasteland, period, and then Ezra Pound wrote in a station of the Metro, period. So now we have two complete sentences that can stand on their own. And always make sure when you do this that you capitalize the first letter of the second sentence that you create. So great, you've got an easy fix for a simple error. But you might say, well, Sam, what if you actually want the sentences to be connected? These aren't just two separate statements, they have associated ideas that I want to highlight for the reader. Well, you can connect them if you want by putting a comma in here and then following that comma with a conjunction. Now, a conjunction is a word that helps to link two sentences together. Unlike your run-on sentence, a conjunction is strong enough to link two sentences together without it becoming sort of smushed together. So here we'll say T.S. Eliot wrote The Wasteland, and Ezra Pound wrote in a station of the metro. And shows that our first clause and our second clause relate to one another. They're similar in some way. You might say, well, but Sam, I want to show how these two clauses are different. These are two different poems with two different ideas. I want to show their contrast. Well, to show contrast, we can say T.S. Eliot wrote The Wasteland, but Ezra Pound wrote in a station of the metro. So now, with this conjunction, there's contrast, there's difference, there's conflict in this sentence. The two things, in some way, oppose one another. There's a whole bunch of other conjunctions like this. You could use or. It wouldn't make a whole lot of sense in this sentence, but or can show how two things are both possible. You can have either one thing or another. You could use therefore or so to show how one clause, the first clause, leads logically into the next one. You can use neither the first clause nor the second clause to show how both things are not true. There's a whole bunch of conjunctions like this, and they all have the same function of linking two ideas together in a logical form. Now be careful. When you have a conjunction like this, you do need the actual conjunction word. You can't just leave the comma on its own. That's called a comma splice. A comma splice is when you have a run-on sentence and you've tried to hide it by sticking this comma in. But a comma just isn't strong enough to hold two sentences together. A comma is kind of like a short pause. It doesn't divide the ideas in the way that a period does. There's one last way of solving this problem, though. You don't have to just get rid of the comma and split the sentences or add a conjunction in. You can fix this problem by adding in a dot above the comma and turning it into what's called a semicolon. A semicolon is kind of like a hybrid. It's kind of like the joining of the comma and the period. It's someplace in between. It shows that the two ideas, the two different clauses that you're working with, are connected, but they have just enough of a break in between them to indicate that they are two separate thoughts still that could stand on their own. So we have T.S. Eliot, in order to show the chaos of modern existence in 1922, wrote The Wasteland. Ezra Pound wrote in a station of the metro. The two ideas are connected. We read the sentence as though the two are associated, but there's enough of a pause to indicate that there is a break in the two complete thoughts. Just be careful that you're not using semicolons where you could just as easily use a comma. Semicolons are really only for this kind of joining, and otherwise a comma works just fine. Always make sure that you're checking whether you've got a complete subject and complete verb to make a whole sentence before you start throwing semicolons in. That pretty much concludes our discussion of constructing complete sentences. To review, a complete sentence has a subject, a verb, a capital letter at the beginning, and a period at the end. You can check to make sure that you have all those things. Otherwise, you will have a sentence fragment and need to fill in one of those two things. If you have too many subjects and verbs, you probably have a run-on sentence and should fix it either with a joining mark of punctuation like the semicolon, a conjunction like and, but, or, nor, therefore, so, and so on, or just take the easy way out and divide the sentences into two separate sentences.